Okay, let's go. This is Randy Kay, and it's my pleasure to turn the tables by interviewing my friend Shaun Tabatt, founder and host of the Shaun Tabatt Show. Shaun has interviewed many of the Christian, what I would call thought leaders of the decade. And now we get a chance to hear from Shaun's collective insights as both a publishing and media executive and someone I know as a very talented and gifted expresser of God's truth. So, welcome, Shaun.
Well, thank you, Randy. It's an honor and a joy to be interviewed by you, and I always have a blast chatting with you. And so I'm eager to see what you ask me. For these sorts of interviews, I'm actually trying to challenge myself and doing one of these a month as time allows. But my big thing is I don't want to know what people are going to ask me before I jump into these. And so I'm always curious to find out what the host wants to know out of this mind of mine. So, yeah.
Well, we'll get to it because I'm excited. I mean, we had talked about doing this a few weeks ago, months, what have you, and really, I thought, Shaun, you have interviewed somewhat 700, 800 people during the course of your show, and these are people that many of us would know, if not most of us. And so you have a unique vantage point. But more importantly, I think you as a person are able to assimilate things in a way that you can express common themes from the both the prophetic and also just more current event type things. And so you're unique as both an innovator and a Christian leader and a husband and father of 10
10.
children.
10, yes, sir.
You're also a publishing executive and a show host. My first question to you is what stands out to you as your kingdom purpose in this world?
If I had to try to distill my kingdom purpose, I think it would be to be kind of a bridge builder and sort of an interpreter. And I'll unpack that a bit. I cut my teeth professionally in the software and tech support space for about 11 years, both being a guy either in the field, on site, or on the phone, and also running call centers and managing large groups of people that were doing support. And so, one of the things I had to learn to be able to do was listen, ask really good questions, think really fast, and try to research and discern and go in a direction. And so, in terms of just curiosity and learning how to process large volumes of information, I think getting to do that for the first 11 years of my career track was very helpful, just to make me not afraid of asking things that I didn't know or just jumping into the unknown, if you will. So I definitely put a lot of that skill set to use today. I think another thing too is I started out on the more evangelical side of the church. I grew up Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod, and then I married a Baptist girl, and then through my brother-in-law Putty, end up getting connected into the Vineyard in the Charismatic Church, and so God's providence led me to be a publicist for Chosen Books, which is a charismatic brand, and over the past 8 years, I've been fully immersed in this world, and it feels like home. But I feel like one of the advantages of growing up in a different part of the church and kind of landing or finding my resting place in a different part of the church is I have the ability to understand kind of different sides of the church and how to help evangelicals understand charismatics and charismatics understand evangelicals. And so, broadly speaking, between my tech background and then just experience in multiple parts of the church, I feel like it's positioned me well to be sort of a translator, communicator, and that really ties into everything I do. Whether it's acquiring new book projects or marketing or just having conversations. It's all communication. So yeah, that's how this all got started. Apparently,
Yeah, in a nutshell,
yeah.
over the course of a long time, you open your show by saying that you will talk about just about anything that shines
Yep,
or any what
shiny
you call a shiny
shiny
object.
objects. Yes, sir.
But in the publishing world, not everything sells.
True.
And the shine or appeal within the Christian worlds of media and publishing appears to have shifted. Do you see any changes in how God is working through these communication worlds today and going forward?
Yeah, I think in terms of some of the things that have pivoted, really the past 2 years have been quite fascinating. Um, Publishers, we almost need to think of ourselves more as media companies than just book publishers. And part of that is just the reality of how people discover and consume media has changed. They're not just going into a bookstore and picking up a hardcover book anymore or a paperback book. It might be an audiobook, an e-course, an ebook, messages on a podcast, videos on YouTube. The expressions of an author's message can go in a lot of different directions in a way that just wasn't the norm 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. So I think we just need to be honest with ourselves and understand that in terms of partnering with an author and communicating a message to an audience, it's not just about publishing anymore. So I feel like that's an important shift, and that's a hard shift because I've worked for Nori Media Group. Destiny Images is the third major trade publisher I've worked for, and I've been with teams of multiple sizes, and I feel like the larger you are in the industry right now, it's hard to pivot because, man, if you're a company that's been at it for 70, 80 years, I always say you're kind of like the 80-year-old elephant slowly going down the path. And it's hard to pivot because you've got protocol and process and, multiple decades of history. Well, we defined publishing. This is how we do publishing. And so, I feel for some of the smaller organizations, pivoting and testing things is a little bit easier for some of us than it is for the larger companies that have maybe been around sometimes for almost twice as long as some of us. So, but that's certainly something people need to keep in mind and really be thinking about. The other thing I would say is we saw a dramatic shift last year in terms of media consumption. Obviously, 2020 was challenging with COVID and people being stuck at home. As I look back and reflect, and where I saw media impact book sales, I mean, certainly things like Sid Roth's It's Supernatural or Today with Marilyn and Sarah and some of these other shows that are established and have been around for a long time, those certainly have a dramatic impact on sales. But what we saw last year was the ability of YouTube shows and podcasts and live streaming to actually impact sales in a meaningful way. We're to the point with some of the shows that we partner with that are primarily on YouTube, where a solid episode on one of those shows can impact retail sales as much as a Sid Roth episode or another fairly established show. And so that's a really big shift because 2 or 3 years ago, I went up and said, "Oh, Randy, we should get you on with this YouTube show because this could move 1,000, 2,000 books over a month and a half." I just didn't know anybody like that. And so, I think some of that is the bar to entry has changed, so a lot more people can create content. It's getting easier in terms of the equipment that we have to make that happen. But just how people consume everything needs to be on your tablet or your smartphone. I feel like we're finally seeing the market penetration level where that it's just happening so at such a large scale. Those what were non-traditional media spaces in the past that are very traditional now, the ability of those outlets to make a dramatic impact, I feel like we're finally there. So yeah, those are the shifts I see. Publishers realize you're a media company. You need to be involved in YouTube and podcasts and lots of other things. And then the other thing is for all of you out there working hard, podcasting, creating content for YouTube and Facebook Live and elsewhere, keep at it because you're dramatically impacting book sales, impacting the lives and platforms of authors, and connecting people to important messages that are going to change their lives. So, yeah, the world's changing.
That it is. And you seem to be on, I don't think I'm overstating it, on the forefront of a lot of these things. We talked earlier about the fact that you have interviewed probably around 800 to 900 people. These are Christian thought leaders. You mentioned one of them that you had interviewed just prior to our time together here. And this is a person that has authored numerous books, a huge church that has influenced people, believers and seekers throughout the world. Now, you've interviewed during the course of this time many seers and or prophets. This is something that I've been wanting to ask you, Shaun. Because now you're able to assimilate what you've heard through your processing advantage of what the common themes are and what you're hearing in terms of how God is speaking today through these people and through you, because you're essentially the voice of collective voice of many of those. Have you uncovered any consistent themes after interviewing so many of these Christian, I'll call them thought leaders?
Yeah, it's interesting how things seem to kind of, I don't know if they come quite in threes, but um, we'll enter into times where we'll talk to a bunch of different authors and leaders, and they all are really grooving on the same themes, or they all start talking to us about the same things. We'll see that in terms of even book proposals and ideas coming in for new projects, where God will be seeming to breathe on something, and you won't have 5, 10 people coming at you with the exact same message, but kind of different lenses or vantage points of something that God just really seems to be breathing on. So when we see that, we're pretty enthusiastic because it feels like, okay, there's a real move of God behind that, because people we trust that we know are discerning and hearing from the Lord are all bringing messages to us that help express different facets or different thoughts about a particular topic or direction God seems to be moving. So we certainly see that there. And also just in terms of talking to people, especially with seer prophetic guests, if you just, whether it doesn't always necessarily even come out in the interview, because a lot of the interviews tend to be focused on a specific product or a book or something that we're promoting. But often in the conversations before and after, that's when the insights seem to pour in for how God's moving, or what's going on. If I had to really press into what I see and hear from people right now, some of the things that I'm hearing from folks like Lana Vosser talks about, that we've entered a new era. I'm hearing a lot of language around this is a third reformation of the church, and I think one of the things we just need to be realistic about is church is going to look different going forward. Once we got past kind of that 60-day window last year of, people, doing church at home and live streaming and all that, you've reached a point where habits have shifted, and the idea that people will easily just transition back into what was, that's not realistic. And so I'm not by any means saying we shouldn't gather together and shouldn't get together and do church like we did as normal before. But in terms of people's behaviors and habits, they've gone through, way more than the amount of time it takes to shift a habit, and so they're going to probably make different choices. And so that's one thing that I think is certainly something we need to keep front and center. Is church is going to look different. For the folks that are pressing in a lot about the new era, they're talking about how the moves of God in this season might be like we've not seen before, or how the Holy Spirit expresses Himself might look different than what we've seen in the past. The themes I think that press into that right now are themes of holiness and reverence, which I would say goes to a back to basics sort of mentality. Actually, I talked to Bill Johnson about this earlier today. I feel like we're stepping into this back to basics season where God is calling us to be in our prayer closets, praying, reading our Bibles, just soaking and spending time listening to the Lord, and just really going after the spiritual disciplines that maybe we've neglected. That's what I see as one of the massive gifts of last year. Not to say it wasn't hard and wasn't awful and wasn't difficult. I acknowledge all of that, but I think one of the best things that came out of 2020 is it showed us as churches and ministries and as individual believers and families, gaping holes in our walk, problems in our life. Because when we get squished and compressed, sometimes Jesus comes out, sometimes other stuff comes out, and we just need to be realistic and evaluate and go, that's not of the Lord, or look, that's an area I really need to shore up. And so we can continue to try to still be on the kind of the pity party train and being sad and angry and frustrated, or we can try to position ourselves to be like, all right, God, how can I move forward? How can I shift? How can I change? So, all that to say, church is going to look different. How we press in. I feel like God's calling us into a season of um, holiness and refinement, maybe like we haven't seen since Jonathan Edwards and the Great Awakening, or just different seasons. People have been talking about a billion souls harvest prophecy last year and different things, and so um, I don't know that we fully see the what's on the horizon as events are unfolding across the globe. But if we thought 2020 was challenging in many ways, I think 2021 will bring just as many different and unique challenges and things for us to process. And if these things we walk through draw us closer to the Lord and really cause us to go deeper in our walk, well then, I say bring it on, because it's what we need, even even if it's not what we necessarily want all the time. We need to be mindful of the season we're in, and as my friend Troy Brewer likes to say, kind of put our big boy pants on and realize that we're adult Christians, or we're grown up in the Lord. And part of being grown up is not making the same decisions we made as children, so to speak. So it's a season of recognizing that we have very grown up responsibility as believers and leaders, and for the benefit of our families and our congregations, we really do need to be bold and brave and step into what God's asking us to do. God doesn't need us to put on a show. And I feel like in terms of church stuff, we saw that in some churches last year. They really had to struggle through, what is the Sunday experience about? If it's just putting on a show, well, when there's nobody in the audience and you're just streaming content online, is in the same way that we all wrestled with what it meant for us as people who attend church. I feel like leaders really have had to struggle with that last year. So 2021, a time definitely of more refining and processing and figuring out what's on the horizon. So a windy answer, Randy. I hope I answered your question.
Well, it's interesting, Shaun. It was a little bit unexpected from my vantage point, at least, because uh, many people have kind of taken the apocalyptic viewpoint of things, the macro,
Right.
that they're starting to look up in the clouds and waiting for Jesus to come down on his white horses. And my personal experience certainly has been on a more personal level with Jesus Christ. That is, when we're looking at the macro, oftentimes it seems like we're taking our eyes off of the real essential point, which is yours truly in our relationship with Jesus Christ. So now we have, as you pointed out, having gone through now, all of us, this kind of face to face with the possibility, if not the imminency of dying and meeting our Maker in the afterlife. So, do you think the Christian now is looking at things in the context more from an eternal perspective of living my life more concertedly for Jesus Christ in anticipation, or maybe thinking of Jesus as being more real and kind of having a kind of getting my act together sort of thing. I've been taking him for granted, and I've been going to church on Sunday, going to work on Monday, and I have my Christian life and I have my work life or my family life. Do you think there's maybe a shift there in terms of people getting more serious about God?
I hope so. I definitely hope so. I think especially here in America, in the West, we've been able to be very insulated and easily compartmentalize everything. For by and large, a lot of us have never had to hardly deal with death. We keep so many things behind the scenes. Many people have never even seen a loved one die, a grandparent or a parent. And, if you haven't had to deal with that yet, well, be blessed, because it does come and it's something to walk through. But I feel like sometimes we're so insulated from all those things, that when things do hit us, it just hits us like a ton of bricks. And so I feel like for a lot of people, they got hit by a ton of bricks last year, having to learn to process and deal with things that we've never had to deal with before. One of the things I thought about a lot last year is every generation has thought they were living in the end times since since Jesus was here last time around. So, the fact that we have people throughout culture saying this is the end, this is the end, this is the end. We've been here before, throughout world history. So that shouldn't necessarily surprise us. Again, kind of touching back on sort of that gift theme. The perspective shift I feel like that's been helpful is to see it as a gift, to see it as an opportunity to be called to live out a faith that has meaning and an opportunity to serve. Um, I talked with a lot of friends last year about being a Christian looks like something. Having faith looks like something. Loving people looks like something. And if all we do is go to church to have an experience, and to get filled up and maybe have our little Holy Ghost tingles and whatnot, I mean, while there's nothing wrong with experiencing those things, if that is it, like it's just this totally me-centered gospel where it's all about me and my experience and how I feel, and I'm a nicer person throughout the week if I get my Sunday fix. I mean, that's a very small Christian life, and so I feel like God's really pushing us to step outside of those boundaries. We kept kept our little Christian life in this perfect, wonderful little box. And God's like, okay, the box is broken and it's going to look different. Now, it's going to take faith. It's going to take boldness. It's going to take stepping outside of our comfort zone. I feel like as believers, we're entering into a season where we're going to enter into probably some really difficult conversations and heated conversations because, boy, across culture, opinions of what's right and what's wrong and what it means to be a Christian and all those sorts of things. There's a lot of kind of verbal news feed, social media persecution right now here. If we're familiar with Voice of the Martyrs or other ministries that work with brothers and sisters across the globe, the persecution they've seen elsewhere is nothing like what like we're still in like preschool level here in the States, in my opinion. But that is a reality. There it's I feel like the world tends to move in cycles, and it's not like Jesus didn't warn us. The idea that people would persecute Christians isn't anything new. So if culture shifts and is not as happy, warm, fuzzy towards Christians, you can probably expect there will be some challenges. At the same time, I go, maybe this is more of the same refining we're being invited to walk into. And I don't know if it's necessarily a bad thing for us to have to process that our faith actually means something. That's I keep going back to this gift idea. I think is one of the most important things that happened last year, where we all had to begin to wrestle with what does it mean to be a Christian, and if I can't go to church on Sundays, what does it look like for me to still practice my faith, and what does it look like to love my neighbor or love my relative who's Democrat and I'm a Republican, or whatever. We really had to try to start grappling with what does our faith mean, and the reality is it looks like something. It's not just ideas. It's not just sentiments of, oh, I love you and be blessed. It actually is action, and it's something tangible and real. And I think everybody's at different places, sort of on that timeline. But yeah, I mean, are we in the end times? We could be. I've talked to lots of leaders who've made, is really the last 6 months, who've made very compelling cases from Scripture and what they see in the news and culture for, gosh, I think we're in the end times. And I go, like I said earlier, yep. And so has every generation before you. So I take that with a grain of salt. And I'm just like, man, if the Lord's returning, aren't we blessed to be in the generation where Jesus comes back and takes us home? However, we should learn from history and not, go wait out in the lake waiting to be taken up, if whatever you might say. It's not time to kind of put down our tools and wait to go home. We still need to be on mission. That's the other thing I think I talked a lot about last year is, um, as the cultural conversation ebbed and flowed and shifted throughout all of 2020, and depending on who you talk to, we had to be about social justice, or we had to be about this thing or that thing, and if you're a Christian, you should be about this or that, or whatnot. It shifted all last year. I kept going back to, has your mission actually changed? If you have a calling and a destiny and an assignment that God put on you to reach the lost and minister and do different things, that didn't magically go away in 2020. Even if people in your church or your pastor or people on social media are telling you this, that, and the other thing, we all had assignments and things God has been asking us to continue pursuing. That didn't go away last year. And so that was probably the biggest, if I had to say that the biggest thing that concerned me last year is people got so caught up in the drama of everything, they almost kind of lost their mission or lost their way a bit, where it's like, well, no, nobody told you to step off of that path that God's had you on and what he's had you pursuing for a long time. So hopefully this year people can really press in and come back more of center, I guess, to what God's calling them to do, or going back to what they were pursuing before. I feel like people just got real paralyzed last year and sort of stuck, or it was like watching a dumpster on fire slowly rolling down the street in front of your house, and you just couldn't take your eyes off it.
That shiny thing, that shiny
Yes,
object that you
yes.
talk about. Right. That's always difficult to get away from the shiny object sometimes, unless it's the light of Jesus Christ. And in classes, sometimes I will ask people to go through an exercise, whether they give them 3 days or a week, where they know they're going to die, and how do they live differently? And of course, the common answer is, I'm going to quit my job and I'm going to take a vacation or do something like that. But that really misses the point of the exercise, which is if I really were to look at my life from the point that this life is a mist, as the Bible, of course, says, then how do I live my life differently? What do I do? How do I prioritize things more concertedly? You know, and you work with a lot of authors, Shaun, um, and everybody. It's said that everybody has a book inside them, but not everyone knows how to write. And sometimes that message is not something that people either need to hear or is intriguing enough that they want to hear it. What would you tell someone who's thinking about writing or communicating vis-a-vis YouTube or any of the media outlets? What would you tell them in terms of qualifying that desire as to whether they should move forward or not?
I definitely think if you feel like God is calling you to express yourself or express an aspect of the kingdom in a message, you should probably go for it. Certainly, if God's sometimes pulling and other times pushing or inviting us into a direction, we should definitely take notice and move ahead. Probably the biggest thing I've learned through the years, and even for me, like I'm very adept at communicating on video and audio. I'm working on my first book project right now, and it's a challenge because it's brand new for me. So you do have to give yourself permission to have training wheels and struggle and learn. And you can, between YouTube and podcasts and books and conversations, you can learn from lots of people how to do different things. But you do have to give yourself permission to start and move in a direction. I think probably, and this would be more of a life principle that wouldn't just apply to communicating in a podcast or video or a book or what have you, is to really try to know what you're about and know what God has you on mission for, what you're called to do. I feel like a lot of people never take the time to get quiet and get alone and really wrestle with God. Why am I here? Like, what are you calling me to do? You've given me, these different talents and abilities and passions, and it's for a purpose. It's not just some haphazard. God was throwing, hey, yeah, let's see, he gets that, throwing darts at the board. It's a little more, a lot more intentional than that. And so, really, that's the place I think you have to start is really wait and hear from the Lord on what he's called you to do, and maybe how those different things you've learned, experiences you've had, talents and abilities, how that comes together. Now that could mean different things in different seasons. I spent 11 years in tech and software, and then I've spent the past decade working in Christian publishing. When I was in college, was that my career path? Either of those? No. I thought I was going to be a pastor initially. And it kind of comes full circle, I guess, right now. I'm sort of a pastor to authors, as it turns out, a lot behind the scenes. So, but really taking that step back and making sure you're on mission, because I feel like if you know the lane that God's asking you to be in, it makes everything so much easier, or it really lets you know where to invest your time, or also the types of people you should be doing life with and collaborating with, because everything is so much more fun in teams and groups, and so finding people that can help you go farther faster. That's the thing that I really learned in my late 30s and early 40s is the people that I rubbed shoulders with changed the trajectory of where I was going, or God would use those relationships to open up other doors. Certainly. So I guess if I had to try to distill it down, take the time to really hear from God what you should be about, and be humble and know that will shift and change in different seasons, maybe as your assignment or your circumstances change. And then really try to understand the scene God might be asking you or inviting you to be a part of, and find people that are also in that same space. And some of that could be partnering with people who are starting out where you are, and other people who are in different spaces along that same journey. Like for me, I'm in a season. I've only been acquiring projects for about a year and a half now for Destiny Image, where I'm building the with the men and women I'm going to be doing life and ministry with for the next 10, 15, 20 years. I mean, you were one of my early acquisitions, Troy Brewer, Sarah Bowling, different people, friends who I've known and worked with in different capacities. And now, we're kind of creating a scene together for an aspect of what Destiny Image is expressing to the kingdom, if you will. And so you're really just finding that scene that God's asking you to be a part of, find the people that you can do life and ministry with. And so, yeah, I guess that would be my answer. Figure out your lane, find people to hang out with you in that lane, and then just go create something, whatever it might be, and be comfortable doing it in lots of different formats. I like I said, I'm very adept with video and audio, and writing is new. Not that I'm a bad writer. I've just never written a whole book at this point. I always like to say it's sort of like the BMW sales guy, marketing guy going down to the factory floor saying, "Hey, I'm going to build me one of these things." Early on, I felt a little bit like that. When your whole life is consumed with others who are very, qualified professionals, having written lots of books. It's just funny on this side of it, 10 years into to try to do that same thing myself. And I'll get to the finish line certainly, but I do know, having talked with lots of authors through the years on my podcast, that you can ask somebody like John Bevere or Bill Johnson, and both of those guys would tell you they never intended to write. They didn't necessarily even like reading books or writing books. They didn't even feel like anybody would care to read what they had to say early on. And yet we look back on some of those folks right now as some of the most accomplished writers in the charismatic space in the Christian publishing industry. So you never know what something will turn into. If God pushes you or pulls you in a direction and you say yes, you may look back, 10, 20 years from now and be like, man, I did not see that, but boy, did God use it, not only to bless other people, but also to grow and stretch you. I mean, you never know what aspect of the assignment you're in now will be for 10, 15 years down the road. I've interviewed Sid Roth a couple times and talked to him a bit about his just journey through broadcasting, and he sort of, I don't know if I'd use fumbled his way, but ended up in pre-recording stuff for radio, and then did radio, and then eventually got into TV, and God just lined him up with different opportunities. Sometimes things that God just said, hey, here, just threw things in his lap that would set him up to be doing what he's doing today. And we look now and it's like, oh, there's a studio and he broadcasts all over the world and it's fantastic. But it all started with like pre-recorded messages, 40, 50 years ago. And so you just never know. God doesn't waste anything like that. All the stuff I learned about working with international clients and project management and all that, sort of running call centers and metrics and statistics and all that stuff plays into what I do now. All the things I've learned through the years doing different things. God uses it to allow me to be very versatile with who I can relate to and how I can communicate and whatnot. So you never know how God will use some of the most seemingly disconnected things to make you just the right person for what He has planned for you down the road.
Yeah. And you're a connector. I can testify of that. You're not just a connector, but you have the discernment to know what needs to connect with the body of Christ and who needs to be that voice to the body for a specific message or story. And so I just want to conclude with this, Shaun, and asking you this question because um, there's so many stories and messages out there, speakers, authors, uh, teachers. And oftentimes, when I've gone and spoken at writers' conferences or participated in them, um, you know, people are looking for that shiny object that they can grab onto. And you said something earlier about the fact that it has to be within you, and you have to have that compulsion to want to express that message or story. In other words, you don't try to find whatever the going theme is or going what's most attractive, and then you teach about it, speak about it, or write about it. So, but I do. Having said that, my final question to you, Shaun, is what messages or stories do you think are needed within the Christian body today?
Wow, that's a small question. No.
Good one to
um,
conclude on.
Yeah, I think in terms of, to touch back on some of what I said earlier, for somebody who's thinking about writing or feels called to write, is you have to be writing things that are true to you. In the same way, I would say how we portray ourselves on social media, like that should be your real life. Don't fake it, because people are going to expect that's who you are, and you'll quickly get to a place, especially if you get famous, where you have a very fragmented life, and that's a lot to manage. Uh, in terms of, oh man, how do I want to position this? I would say in terms of messages, specifically in a book, make sure it's something you want to talk about for 5 to 10 years. The worst situation is when an author writes a book and then they never speak about it. And I've had to have that conversation with authors and have had that experience where a book simply doesn't sell because they don't do anything to promote it. It was something they were enthusiastic about writing, or maybe an editor said, "Hey, I'd love to have you write about this," but yet nothing that they did in their speaking career or ministry even touched on that topic ever again. And that's a book that generally doesn't sell because if an author's not enthusiastic about a book, generally an audience won't be. So make sure something is a message that you really are going to live with, want to talk about. Another kind of, I guess, caution I would offer is remember when you write something, you become the poster boy or poster girl for that message. And so, um, in the course of doing so many interviews, I encounter people who don't live out the messages they've written, or you start digging, and it's clear that this isn't something that has any bearing in their own life even. And so the one thing I always get excited about is when I encounter an author who they'll tell me they actually read their own book and it encourages them, or if it's something more of like a process or system kind of a book, more in like marketing or business, when they actually utilize those sorts of things to run their business or do life. I'm like, man, they believe in this message so much. Not only did they write it, they're living it out. So all that to say, just know that you have to, people are going to expect that you're going to live out the message that you write. Big picture in terms of, that was a long way to get to where I want to go next. Big picture in terms of what's needed right now. I think that kind of that back to basics theme I was touching on earlier, the thing that God won't let me move away from right now is discipleship and equipping. As we're stepping into an age where the needs of culture are different, what it means to do church, it might not look like big church, mega church anymore. It might be more smaller house church or other kind of you know hub gatherings that are connected to a larger sort of maybe further down the spoke gatherings that are connected to a hub in the center. Things are just going to look different. And so, the question I keep asking is, what does it look like to equip and disciple people who need to respond to the crises in culture right now? That might look different than how we did discipleship in the 90s or in the 2000s, where some of which, I might say almost felt like, here, let us help you assimilate to church so you don't feel like a fish out of water. Good luck. I hope it goes well. I'm very excited with, with different authors and leaders that I see going very deep in discipleship with their people. Often it looks it's not this large group. It's a group of 10 or less people really coming together and doing life together and sharpening each other and challenging each other. It's messy. It's difficult. Yet the fruit on the other side of that is so fantastic. So definitely discipleship and equipping, I feel like, are going to be key. I don't know that we fully understand the resources that we're going to need 3 to 5 years from now. So I feel like we're going to start creating those things, yet we don't see in full what we're going to need. Um, and then the last thing I would say, and this would tie to some of the things I'm wrestling with as I'm trying to write this book, is I feel like we've got, or write my first book. I feel like culturally we had a real identity crisis last year. When you look at, especially I feel like the Gen Xers and the millennials, but just more broad, you paint pretty broadly in culture, people being drawn into every movement they encountered last year, or whatever somebody said was the thing they needed to be angry about or concerned about. People just kind of went with whatever. And I think a lot of that stems from a lack of belonging. The people growing up in broken homes, not knowing who they are or where they came from, not sure where they are now, and certainly not knowing where they're going. So in terms of big picture, we have a real identity crisis, a belonging crisis. People need mothers and fathers and grandmothers and grandfathers pouring into their lives, and we all have different stories, good, bad, and in between, of our own families of origin, and sometimes those things come from into our lives from people that are outside of our family of origin, to speak. And so I think that's going to be really critical moving ahead. Um, and also, one last thing I would probably wrap with is in terms of younger leaders. I'm reading a book called Boomers right now that I'm excited about. I'm going to interview that author. It's a mainstream book. It's not a Christian book, but it's looking culturally at some of the interesting things that happened with the Boomer generation and how that impacted Gen X and millennials, kind of their kids, and what it means in culture right now. But there's a weird phenomenon, and I've talked to a bunch of different leaders about this the latter half of last year. Is we've got a lot of boomers who are still maintaining their positions of power in church and industry. Gen X oddly kind of got passed over because the generation after Gen X is refusing to retire or relinquish power. And then you have a lot of millennials who, interestingly, were promoted so far so fast. They're having to carry things that they don't really have the strength yet to quite carry or know how to deal with well. And so I feel like there is kind of a weird crisis that's on the horizon for the church as we wrestle with what does it look like for these, really four generations between boomers, Xers, millennials, and Zs. How do we function in the body together and move forward? And so I think that's something that we're going to have to struggle and wrestle with. So I'm hopeful somebody will write some helpful resources to deal with that. I look at a lot of what I saw from especially millennial leaders last year. If they just went to their peers, last year was a big struggle leadership wise to figure out what to do as a church body. I wished a lot of more people would have gone to the fathers and mothers and the grandmothers and grandfathers last year for wisdom and insight because it's I think of Mario Murillo or some of these other seasoned leaders who they've seen riots before. A lot of the things we encountered last year. If you talk to somebody who you know spent time in the 60s and 70s and early 80s, it's not like they haven't seen some of these similar challenges before. And if you didn't have access to people, more tenured folks in your life, it was a rough time to know what to do. And so maybe going ahead in the next few years, maybe we need to be humble and be willing to talk to people who are a bit further down the road and not always go to our peer groups or the internet for insight and wisdom. So that was another really, really broad answer, but yeah, definitely discipleship and equipping. We need to really wrestle with the crisis amongst the different generations and kind of the bickering and infighting to figure out who's in charge or what we're doing. I think that's going to be important, and also dealing with identity issues. We need to refuse to be led by social media and news and whatever the rage headline of the day is. Don't be drawn in by that. Just because somebody says that Sean and Randy, you must absolutely be concerned about this, doesn't mean that God thinks we need to be concerned about that, or whatever news or culture says is the response to that. Is that actually God's response to that? And so we maybe need to deal with some of our worldview issues and process things through more of a biblical lens and not necessarily a cultural lens. So yeah, there's a no lack of need in the next few years to figure out how to walk this out. And so I'm excited to see what resources emerge to meet the needs of the church and meet the needs of the culture. It'll be a challenging time, but a shaping time with a great harvest. So good things ahead.
Yes, and thank you for that insight because the culture does oftentimes influence us, when in fact the culture of within the Christian body is something that should not morph terribly by virtue of social cultures. But you have helped me, Sean, in coaching me. I was a writer of business books. I wrote articles. I wrote for the Wall Street Journal and Forbes. I was in that space. Started with the Chicago Tribune in my writing, and then I went corporate and all of that. So, 14 years. I we worked on a project that was a book that was about brokenness, and then it started with the near-death experience that I had when I clinically died, and I spoke with Don Piper, who wrote 90 Minutes in Heaven, and he said, this is going to consume your life, and you're and I thought, no, I'm not prepared to talk about yours truly and the experience that I had and all of that, because that was my experience. But and when God hits you as a writer, speaker, just a reader, or whatever participant in the social structure, the answer that I received, and I'm sure it would be for many, if not all, who are seeking the Lord, is no, I'm not asking you to tell the Lord speaking to me about yourself. I'm asking you to talk about me. So that's a paradigm shift. Shaun, you have brought us so many great insights and just a ponderance of of truths and things that we will can dwell on for a long, long time. I appreciate your time and your wisdom in all of this. This has been Randy Kay speaking in turn to Shaun Tabatt, which is, as I mentioned at the onset of this show, a true turnabout. So thank you, Shaun, for allowing me to do this with you.
Well, my pleasure, Randy. I appreciate you being willing to steal the microphone away from me, so to speak, and interview me. And so, again, for me, if this is the first time you're encountering me, you can find most of my stuff at shauntabatt.com or just look me up on the internet. I'm pretty easy to find. My podcast is called The Shaun Tabatt Show. And Randy, for people who want to connect with you, find out more about your book, your ministry, where's the place we can connect with you on the web as well?
So randyk.org is mine. And, you know, please, I encourage everyone to go to the Shaun Tabatt Show. I mean, there's a lot of stuff out there, but you got to listen to Shaun's interviews because he's calling out things that I just don't see in other venues. So encourage you to do that. Go to the Shaun Tabatt Show, listen to him and his interviews, and of course, thank you for asking, Shaun. Mine is randyk.org. If you would like to learn more about what we're doing on this end. So thank you again, Shaun. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Randy. We'll talk to you again soon.